Good morning, and welcome to Seattle Atheist Church. At Seattle Atheist Church, you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. That's what we mean by calling it an atheist church. Our church was founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We attempt to be excellent to all conscious beings, and we believe in good because good works in non-mysterious ways. That sounds right to you. You are probably in the right place. I want to make a few announcements. Today, after church, we are going to have pumpkin carving. So please see Jack and Troy if you're interested in that. There will be pumpkin carving immediately after church today. And the first Friday of the month, we are going to have movie night. So sign up now because spaces are limited if you're interested in coming to movie night. Hannah Gatsby Nanette, do I have that right? Okay, so I have it on a reliable source that is going to be very interesting. So I'll be there and hope you will be too. So anyway, if you'd like to support our church, we have a donation jar at the back of the room, or you can go to seattleatheist.church. We'll have a brief talk followed by a brief discussion, and we'll end at 1:30 so that we have time to either mill about and or get to pumpkin carving. All right, thanks a lot. Welcome back.
All right, let me start by thanking all of you for coming. I know this is kind of a weird topic. How many of you came to the first edition of this topic? Fantastic. All right, so don't worry, no prior knowledge is necessary. We'll start from the beginning. In this talk, I'm going to talk about the roundworm. And let me start by explaining why I think the roundworm is an interesting subject. So Darwin argued in his book, The Descent of Man, that humans are only different in degree and not kind from all the other animals on Earth. In particular, he says that human mental states and morality, he tackles both, can be explained through natural selection. He writes, quote, "There's no fundamental difference between man and the higher mammals in their mental faculties, and that all the differences are differences of degree, not of kind." So Darwin wrote The Descent of Man back in 1871. That's almost 150 years ago now. But the ideas from the book still haven't completely sunk in. It's a shocking book. It's still a page turner. Highly recommend you read it if you haven't read it lately. The idea that humans are not fundamentally different from all the other, beasts and insects and stuff on Earth is really hard for humans to accept. It still seems shocking. We think of humans as being unique in so many different ways. I haven't seen a lobster invent an iPhone, a dolphin climb Mount Everest, a spider fly to the moon, or a cockroach write a symphony. These are unique human accomplishments. Stupid insects, stupid beasts. Humans are cool, right? So to compare humans to worms seems like the very definition of demeaning. We're better than that. Or are we? Or maybe worms are much more impressive than we thought. So the subject of this talk is going to be the roundworm, or more precisely, C. elegans. C. elegans is perhaps the most studied creature on Earth. It's a model organism, so scientists have spent a huge amount of time studying C. elegans. By the end of this talk, I hope to convince you that there's nothing wrong, much less demeaning, with recognizing roundworms, pigeons, bulldogs, and centipedes as your brothers and sisters in the same family of life. All right, so let me start by talking a little bit about C. elegans. I have to tell you, I knew nothing about C. elegans before writing this first talk a couple years ago. But what happened was I was trying to get a better understanding of our knowledge around basic animals, basic insects. And I came across something called the Worm Atlas. It's at wormatlas.org. And it's a huge database of all the information that we have about this one creature, about C. elegans. C. elegans, that's short for Senior habitus elegans, and Senior habitus means recent rod-like elegant. That's what it means. So it means recent rod-like elegant worm. That's where the name C. elegans comes from. As I said, it's a model organism. What that means is there's been an incredible amount of resources put into studying it, but it's also used as a basis for a lot of different scientific studies. So we've accumulated a massive amount of information about it. It's the first multicellular organism to have its full genome sequenced. So it has exactly 959 cells. It has 20,000 protein encoding genes. That's only slightly fewer than humans, by the way. About as much information in its DNA as used for humans. Not a lot of difference there. But it's the first and currently only organism on Earth to have its entire connectome mapped. And what a connectome is all the neurons and the connections between all the neurons in the head, so they know everything about the map of its brain. It's the only creature on Earth that we have that information for. And the reason for that is it turns out that C. elegans, it's really simple. It only has 302 neurons. So it has 302 neurons. And it's about a third of all of their cells are neurons. It has interneurons and motor cells. For comparison, humans have about 86 billion neurons. So we're comparing 302 neurons to 86 billion. There is a slight difference in degree, if not kind there. Elephants have 267 billion. So elephants have many more neurons than humans do. So, a count of neurons doesn't necessarily, correlate with the ability to invent iPhones. Something you can take away from that. We have a complete description of all synaptic connections between these neurons. There's about 7,500 total synapses going on there in the connectome. The other interesting thing, and this will come up again and again during this talk, is there's a project associated with C. elegans called the Open Worm Project. And this is a really fascinating project because what they're trying to do is, now that we have all this information about C. elegans, why not simulate it in a computer? Why not create a complete computer simulation of all the neurons and all the connections, and then wire that up to a physical simulation so we have a complete computer simulation of a living organism. And this isn't just sort of something so it will act the same way. This is trying to simulate it down to the ways that the neurons interact, down at the lowest level possible to create an accurate representation of the behavior of this worm. So again, it's called the Open Worm Project. It's at openworm.org. They used to have an iPhone app. I don't think they've kept it updated. They also have all these online simulators you can play with. They're pretty cool. So they have their source code on GitHub if you want to download it and run it on your own computer. That's always fun. And they promote their project as, quote, building the first digital life form. It's the first attempt to create a purely digital version of a living organism. I think it's really cool. They have unit tests. If you're a software developer, you know what unit tests are, but they're a little different than standard unit tests. What they've done is they've created a database of actual worm behaviors, C. elegans behaviors, and then they're testing their model against those behaviors in the target database. So the idea is as they get closer and closer to actual worm behavior, they'll have a way of measuring that, of telling whether or not they're getting there or not. And then finally, just for fun, they did this project where they took the simulated C. elegans brain in a real world Lego robot, which is pretty cool, and they found that the Lego robot behaved, in sort of predictable ways, like an actual C. elegans would. It would move in different ways, and if you touched it on its nose, it would back up, and it would do behaviors that were similar to C. elegans' actual ones in nature, except it was a Lego robot version of it. All right, so I want to talk just for a few minutes about some odd facts about C. elegans, because I want you to get a sense of just how complex this little creature is. So first, they're about 1 millimeter long. They're little teeny creatures. You can find them in compost and rotting fruit, so they're out there in the wild. They live only for about 2 weeks, so they have a really short lifespan. And they can reproduce, luckily. They can reproduce in 3 days, otherwise there'd be a problem there. And most C. elegans are hermaphrodites, except this is really weird. 1 in 1,000 is male. So almost all of them are hermaphrodites, and then you have a male and 1 in 1,000. And the male C. elegans, they get an extra 81 neurons in their tail. So they're extra smart. the one in 1,000, male C. elegans. And then, this is really bizarre. When a C. elegans dies, they release a dramatic burst of blue fluorescence. This is called death fluorescence. So when they die, they go poof, and you get this blue flash of color. Really odd. Like the monster from Alien, C. elegans develop through 4 different stages. If food resources become low, they'll go into a special alternative stage where their mouths are sealed and they can live months without any resources. So they'll go into this survival state where they can survive months until there's food again around them, which is kind of cool. Cool if humans could do that. But anyway, maybe not. I don't know. I'm not sure if that sounds good. And they do sleep. So C. elegans do go into a restful state during sleep, like sleep. All right, so these are kind of small, odd, simple creatures, but do they exhibit complex behavior? And the answer is yes. They actually exhibit surprisingly complex behavior. So you might ask, well, how do you study that? How do you actually figure out, which neurons are responsible for complex behavior? This is kind of cool too. There's 2 ways they do it. One way is you can use lasers to knock out individual neurons, and then you just study the behavior of your knockout. There's only 302 neurons. So you knock out a neuron, and you'll see what happens to the C. elegans. But there's an even cooler way that they came up recently. So some Harvard scientists figured out C. elegans, they have transparent skin. And with a little bit of gene splicing, you can create neurons that are light sensitive, that you can activate or depress when you shine a laser at it. So they actually created this framework where this table keeps the C. elegans in the middle of this microscope, and then they have an array of lasers which can fire at real time and actually excite or depress individual neurons in the C. elegans as it's swimming around. It's a really complex, so they created, the Harvard scientists, they named their software Mind Control. So they're using their mind control software, and they can target individual neurons in a live, moving C. elegans to control its behavior. And so they've gotten to the point now where they can make it turn left, or they can make it turn right, they can make it lay an egg, which is kind of cool, just by targeting the right neurons and exciting the right neurons. They can do remote time control in real time. Okay, so those are 2 ways they can study it. The basic behavior of a C. elegans. A C. elegans spends its typical day just sort of moving forward with occasional spontaneous reversals. These are called omega turns. So they just kind of swim along. Every once in a while, they'll do an omega turn. They'll swim in another direction. That's what they do most of the time. 32 of their neurons, that's about 10% of their neurons, are used to detect chemical smells. So they'll pick up on something that smells like food, and they'll go that direction. They have 5 command interneurons that cause them to move in the different directions. So it's a pretty simple system. They can go into something called eating behavior, which again is a very predictable set of things they do. There's 3 different modes they can be in eating behavior. They can be something called dwelling behavior, and in the presence of food, if they pick up food, the C. elegans moves slowly and makes frequent turns and reversals. So they find an area of food, and then they just hone in on that little area, and they keep moving around in it. But then they go into a scanning behavior once they don't find food anymore, and so they increase their speed tenfold, so they start checking out a larger area. And then they can do dispersal behavior, which decreases their turn rate, which causes them to look for completely new food sources. So they have these basic modes that they go into that are predictable where they're scanning for food. The other cool thing about C. elegans is it has a predator. It has a natural enemy in nature, and it's evolved a very specific response to be able to avoid that predator. So normally, a roundworm spends much of its time moving forward while it's wiggling its head back and forth, going along. If you touch the front part of the worm, it will reverse motors completely, stop wiggling its head. And it won't do that if you touch its nose or the back part. It's only when you touch toward the very top of the head over here, it will reverse its direction. And the reason for that is there's a fungi that hunts the roundworm by trapping it in a constricting ring. So you can think of the poor C. elegans moving around, and this fungi that has this ring that wraps around its throat and tries to constrict it and get it. So what the C. elegans has done is it's evolved this mechanism. As soon as you touch it right at that same place where the fungi goes after it, it will immediately reverse course. It will back up to try to get out of that ring so it can escape its predator. So this response is one of the rare examples where a complete path from sensory neuron to coordinated motor output is understood by scientists. So we understand every step of that process. We understand the sensory neuron, how it connects into the motor neurons, how it changes locomotion. We understand that's probably the only action on Earth that we completely understand in an animal at the level of neurons and motor neurons and sensory neurons, that we can map that whole course of action completely. So we understand how it escapes from predators at a very, very low level. Finally, C. elegans does learn. It has the ability to learn. So if you tap a Petri plate holding C. elegans, it will reverse motors. If you do it a lot, if you're really irritating about it, it'll stop doing it as frequently. So if you pound the Petri dish all the time, it won't become as sensitive anymore. So habituate to the tapping of the Petri dish. C. elegans also supports associative learning. So it turns out that roundworms, this is probably knowledge that you wish I wasn't giving you, but roundworms love the smell of fake popcorn. That really gets them excited. So if you want to attract a roundworm, get some fake popcorn. And you can teach it, though, to start avoiding fake popcorn if you mix it in with an acid solution. So it can learn, oh, I thought that popcorn was great, but now the humans have made it acid popcorn, and it won't go after the acid popcorn anymore. So it can learn to reassociate different sources of food. In their article, An Elegant Mind, that was the name of the article, get it? Even L. Ardiel and Catherine Rankin write, quote, "The deterministic development of the worm's nervous system would seem to limit its usefulness as a model to study behavioral plasticity. But time and again, the worm has demonstrated its extreme sensitivity to experience. Every sensory modality study can mediate learning. Working with C. elegans confirms the importance of learning and memory to survival. Even this relatively small organism shows a large number of degrees of freedom in adapting its behavior to reflect its experience." So the takeaway from that is, even though this is an incredibly simple creature, it still learns. It still has learning and memory, and it still interacts with the environment to change its behavior. All right, so that's my overview of the roundworm. So why do I care about this? Well, going back to Darwin's question, are these worms fundamentally different in kind than humans, or are they only different in degree? I mean, again, they have 302 neurons, we have billions. Is it just a matter of you take a worm, add more neurons to it, and you get a human? Or is there something actually fundamentally different about humans than there is about worms? So the stumbling blocks in this area, people usually bring up, yeah, but humans have free will. And they have consciousness, and those stupid little worms have neither of those. They're little robots. So I'm not going to talk about free will at all in this talk, because we've already spent a lot of time in church talking about free will, and no one's come up with a coherent contra-causal theory of free will so far. And I don't think humans have it. I don't think roundworms have it. So I don't want to waste any time on it. I'd just point out, why would anyone want to act without a cause? Because that seems like you're saying that people are acting for no reason at all, and I don't want that kind of free will, and I don't want my worms to have that free will either. So I'm going to skip the subject. But I am going to move on to consciousness, because that's always something that people bring up, and it has been an area of scientific and, of course, philosophical study, the question of whether or not this is a dividing line between man and beasts, or in this case, between humans and worms, whether this consciousness thing is a bright line that distinguishes humans from what worms are doing. So consciousness is definitely mysterious. We've also talked about that. We have some pretty clear examples of things we think are not conscious. Most people think rocks, for example, aren't conscious. Thermostats, probably not. My iPhone, I don't think so. Mold, most people don't think mold is conscious. Those are simple things. Most people think like your pet dog, definitely conscious. Orangutans, I know you can pronounce it orangutans, I like to say orangutan. Orangutans are conscious, and humans, those are, come on, if anyone's conscious, humans are. So we have two clear categories where we can sort things out, but we don't really have any way of determining whether something falls in the conscious or the unconscious category, especially the roundworm. And it turns out that there's a lot of debate about whether roundworms are conscious. So let me explain a little more about what I'm thinking of. We know that roundworms do have predators. We just talked about that, the fungi that tries to choke them to death. So the question is, do they actually experience fear in that situation? Does a roundworm feel fear when it feels like it's being choked by one of those, horrible beasts out there hunting it down? We know that roundworms get super excited about the smell of fake popcorn. Does that actually translate into happiness or pleasure? Do they have the experience of pleasure or pain when they smell that popcorn? Like we do when, I don't know, when I smell a nice donut or something. Do you get all excited about it? So at first blush, roundworms might seem more like thermostats than puppy dogs. And part of the reason here that we think this is the way that I've sort of presented the roundworm. Remember, we already have a almost complete simulation of the way a roundworm works. For certain behaviors, we know down to the neuron how those actions work, so they seem extremely mechanistic, right? A roundworm has a very predictable mechanistic behavior, but that is actually part of the process of explanation, right? We want to get to the point where we have an extremely mechanistic explanation of its every behavior, because that means that we fully understand that action. It's a lot easier to do that with 300 neurons than billions of neurons. So there's a question whether just explaining something takes away our belief that it could be conscious or not. So another way of putting this whole subject is, we know the Open Worm project is actively building complete computer simulation of a roundworm. One question that we should ask is, how do we know that that simulation isn't already conscious? The simulation, not the actual roundworm. In other words, does the simulated roundworm already feel pain? And remember, this simulation is based on the exact neuron behavior. So it's not just sort of a toy copy. It's actually trying to simulate it down to, at a functional level, every aspect of a roundworm. And I just want to emphasize that this question isn't just sort of a passing curiosity. The reason why we would be concerned about whether something like a roundworm is conscious is we base a lot of our judgments about morality based on a creature's ability to experience conscious pain. For example, we don't care a lot about kicking around rocks or crushing rocks or destroying rocks because we assume that rocks just aren't conscious. They don't have any pain at all. We don't worry about flipping the switch and turning off the Halo game and eliminating all those AI characters running around in Halo because we assume that they don't feel pain. So we have part of our notion of morality is that we only really care about creatures who can have that conscious experience of pain, not just act like they're having pain. So the question of at what point does a roundworm feel conscious pain is really important. All right, so how do we answer that question? Well, one thing, there was an article recently published. It's a somewhat plausible account of consciousness. It was published in the National Academy of Sciences. It was entitled, "What Insects Can Tell Us About the Origins of Consciousness." It was written by a neuroscientist and a philosopher, Andrew Barron and Colin Klein. And what they argue is that they believe that there's many insects and other types of animals that are conscious. But unfortunately, roundworm doesn't make the cut. So they explicitly talk about the roundworm and whether or not they think it's conscious. Bees, yes. Humans, yes. Roundworms, no. And let me explain their logic here. So the basic argument is they start with by citing the philosopher Thomas Nagel. And they claim that consciousness is marked by the presence of subjective experience. That's the defining characteristic of consciousness. You have to have subjective experience. And then they claim, based on some other work, invertebrates, such as monkeys, sharks, T-Rexes, and humans, the midbrain is responsible for subjective experience. So they spend a lot of time defending that argument. Apparently, one of the main functions of the midbrain is to combine interoceptive, that's stimuli arising from within the body, and exteroceptive, stimuli external to the body, sensory information, so that you can get a one representation of an organism's place in its environment. In other words, the way of saying that is midbrain, deeper part of the brain, is constantly in this process of taking external stimulation, internal stimulation, stuff going on in the body, combining all of that to create one model representation of that organism's position in three-dimensional space, so it can figure out, it can represent itself in the environment. And they claim that there's a bunch of stuff that organisms can do once they have that. They can know things are like behind barriers. They can represent reality and make better decisions. Again, I always think of like computer simulations in these cases, like Halo characters making representations of maps and knowing where things are. They have a way of being able not just to react to immediate stimulation, they have a way of representing their place within reality so they can make decisions even about things that they can't immediately sense or see. They have something that they're representing about their place. So this is a very ancient structure, the midbrain structure that's responsible for that. That's why it goes back to insects. It's something that they think we share with insects. Bees have this, T-Rexes have this, but they claim that the roundworm does not have it. One thing I should also emphasize here is none of this is based on the human cortex. They don't think any advanced thought is required for consciousness. They're definitely not talking about a self-awareness theory of consciousness here. It's not about the ability to be reflective. You don't have to be able to, you don't have to be particularly smart to be conscious. It's the subjective integration experience which explains consciousness. That's what they're after. Okay, so they say the roundworm isn't capable of creating a model of their place in the world. They write, even though roundworms have a centralized nervous system and memory, they lack the egocentric modeling of the environment that's required for subjective experience. Further, it is because they lack the capacity to make such models that they are unable to do a variety of tasks that vertebrates and insects handle with ease. And those tasks, again, are predicting where things are even when you can't see it, being able to create a model of reality that you can interact with. Okay, so that's the theory. And it seems like a plausible scientific theory of consciousness, right? I mean, whenever we're explaining something, we want some sort of explanation of what's it good for, what's it do. This seems like, consciousness has something to do with our representation of ourselves in the world. Seems like, okay, this seems like we're going along the right path here. So it seems like, darn it, as much as I like that roundworm, doesn't get the consciousness thing. My only problem with this is it doesn't really address the hard problem of consciousness. And I think actually in this article, although it's a plausible explanation of, maybe of a really interesting structure that we share with other animals, the problem is it doesn't really get to the hard problem of consciousness. And I just want to explain a little more what that is. So the authors of the article refer to Thomas Nagel's famous article, What It's Like to Be a Bat, to justify their characterization of consciousness as subjective experience. But I think they understand Nagel's definition of consciousness in that article. So there's two important senses of subjective experience that are getting confused here. The philosopher Ned Block distinguishes them by saying there's something called phenomenal consciousness, which is experience. And the phenomenally conscious aspect of a state is what it's like to be in that state. And then there's access consciousness, which is availability for use in reasoning and rationally guiding speech and action. So again, there's really two different types of consciousness being confused here. There's access consciousness and there's phenomenal consciousness. And there are certain places like in the article where they just switch rapidly between the two. The whole problem of access consciousness isn't really what Nagel's talking about. In fact, he's pretty explicit in the article that the problem of access consciousness was an interesting scientific question about exactly how information is integrated in the brain, how how an animal represents reality isn't really a fundamentally hard problem. We do it all the time when we create, video games. We're always creating creatures that represent their position on the map and are able to navigate in that world. That's not the hard and interesting problem of consciousness. That's just the problem of how do we create the right algorithms and representations to be able to help a creature navigate the universe. The hard and interesting question is the experience of consciousness, the pain of pain when someone pricks your finger, the blue of the sky, the experience that you're having, that presumably rocks never experience pain. They just can't do it. But humans, possibly roundworms, and definitely puppy dogs, do have the experience of pain. And that's the hard problem that needs to be addressed. What Nagel writes in the article that they refer to is, conscious experience is a widespread phenomenon. It occurs at many levels of animal life, though we cannot be sure of its presence in the simpler organisms, and it's very difficult to say in general what provides evidence of it. Some extremists have been prepared to deny it, even of mammals other than man. He's not even thinking of Dennett, who denies it in man. But no doubt it occurs in countless forms totally unimaginable to us on other planets and other solar systems throughout the universe. But no matter how the form may vary, the fact that an organism has conscious experience at all means basically that there's something it is like to be that organism. There may be further implications about the form of experience. There may be, even though I doubt it, be implications about the behavior of the organism. But fundamentally, an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there's something that is to be that organism, something it is like for the organism. We may call this the subjective character of experience. And so clearly by subjective character of experience, Nagel is referring to phenomenal consciousness and not access consciousness. Nagel in that article makes the argument that we can never know what it's like to be a bat because bats experience the world in a fundamentally different way than humans. Humans use primarily vision, right, to get around the world. Bats use sonar. They use echolocation to be able to figure out, to be able to experience the world. Nagel writes, bat sonar, though clearly a form of perception, is not similar in its operation to any sense that we possess, and there's no reason to suppose that subjectively like anything we can experience or imagine. This appears to create difficulties for the notion of what it's like to be a bat. So he writes, our own experience provides the basic material for our imagination, whose range is therefore limited. It would not help to try to imagine that one has webbing on one's arms, which enables one to fly around at dusk and dawn catching insects in one's mouth, that one has very poor vision and perceives their surrounding world by a system of reflected high-frequency sound signals, and that one spends the day hanging upside down by one's feet in an attic. Insofar as I can imagine this, which is not very far, it tells me only what it would be like for me to behave as a bat behaves. But that is not the question. I want to know what it's like for a bat to be a bat. If I try to imagine this, I am restricted to the resources of my own mind, and those resources are inadequate to the task. I cannot perform it either by imagining additions to my present experience, or by imagining segments gradually subtracted for it, or by imagining some combination of additions, subtractions, and modifications. So what he's saying here is, you just can't do it. You, as much as you like to pretend like you can have the experience of how a bat imagines the world, that's not something accessible to you, because yes, you can spend all day hanging upside down, in your living room. You can go around snatching insects and sticking in your mouth, but that doesn't get to the fundamental experience that a bat has of the world, because you don't have anything like it. And yes, you could imagine some sort of gradual process of, maybe in the future someone could take a bat's brain and create a little cord and plug it into your brain, and you could experience the world the same way that the bat does. The problem for that is, yes, that might be possible. You might be able to experience the world as a bat does in the future, but you still can't imagine what that experience would be right now. It's not something that's accessible to you, because they have a fundamentally different conscious experience of the world than you do. Okay. So this gets to a general problem with functional explanations of consciousness, like the midbrain integration theory that we just discussed. They typically leave out the hard problem of consciousness. They address everything except for the thing that really requires explanation. Realize that we're building a really, really, really good simulation of a roundworm right now with the Open Worm project, and we're using a database of behaviors from real roundworms. We're making the simulated worm function closer and closer to an actual worm. So according to this sort of functionalist approach to explaining consciousness, there should be a point where a simulated roundworm is conscious, right? It has the exact same interactions going on in its little simulated brain as an actual roundworm, and we should be, or if it's not the roundworm, there's a similar project going on for the human brain, and there should be some sort of point where once we add, the right number of neurons, you should automatically get that spark of consciousness. But I personally find it super difficult to believe that a little change in algorithm is going to be enough to be able to get that spark of consciousness going. So I just want to conclude here. So let me go back to the very start of the talk. I said at the beginning, Darwin claimed that humans are different only in degree and not kind from other animals. That's still a shocking claim 150 years later. With the Open Worm project, we're getting very close to being able to fully simulate a living creature for the first time. A living creature that has learning and advanced behavior, complex behavior. And so you might think that that would bring us to the point where we can finally answer the question of what is consciousness. But I think that actually doesn't help us with this particular problem at all. That having complete simulation of the roundworm doesn't get us any closer to answering the hard problem of consciousness. Again, you can imagine an open human project that has the exact same goals as the open worm project. It would take a little more funding because some more neurons there, 86 billion neurons. You can imagine building the same unit test system, take actual behaviors of humans until you built a model that unit tests the same as an actual human. But I think at the end of the project, I have no reason to believe that we would have any understanding of consciousness. So let's stop here and discuss.